Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. And today's episode, I want it to run around 50 minutes. I think it might be a little bit longer. I'm hoping it's not too long, but I'm thinking it might be a good show, long show, but hopefully not too long. So let's get into it. Today's episode, I want to talk about the authentic self. Before we get into talking about the authentic self, I do want to make a disclaimer. I don't know if it's a disclaimer. I just want to make a clarification. I'm hearing in the general public the word authenticity a lot more recently. I do think it gets misused a lot of times. For example, I've had people who will say, well, I was just being my authentic self. I've had clients in sessions before telling me about something that happened during their week, and they will say, well, I was just being my authentic self. And I'll say, no, that's not your authentic self. That was your asshole self, or that was you being very dysregulated. Or I'll have a client who will tell me about a conversation they were having with their partner or with a friend. And I will point out, it sounds like you were dumping all of your feelings out for them to have to sort through. That's not necessarily authentic. I hope that one of the things today's episode does is paint a clear picture about what is the authentic self. And from that clear picture, you can also know what is not the authentic self. One of the things that I watch for often in a therapy session is the moment that a client's authentic self starts to stand up and have a voice. If you've been in therapy with me, you've probably heard me ask questions like, what do you think about that? Or what do you want to say about that? Sometimes I'll ask, what would your wise self or what would your functional adult self do in this moment or speak to in this situation? And if it's too early in our work together, I've noticed that many clients will struggle to answer those questions. And that's not because they don't have an authentic self, but often they've spent years becoming experts on everyone else. They know what their spouse wants. They know what their parents expect. They know what will keep the peace. They know what won't upset someone. They know what the right answer is supposed to be. And they know when to not talk. So when I'm asking them, what do you think? Or what do you want? There's usually a long pause with a puzzled look. That pause makes sense because, as I've often said, the first place we learn relationships is in our family. Long before we have language for it. We're learning what helps us feel connected, what creates distance, what gets us attention or criticism, what feels safe, and what does not. Children are always making meaning about other people, about relationships, and about themselves. One of the things I've come to realize as a therapist is before that voice that I'm asking to speak can speak, there's usually a period of reparenting. Reparenting, I would say, is about going back and giving that younger self what they didn't get the first time so that their development that got interrupted can resume. Once that groundwork is laid, I will see something begin to shift. Clients start recognizing a voice that feels different from fear or shame, people pleasing or perfectionism, basically the old survival strategies. and they begin to recognize that voice as themselves. I don't think that therapy helps people find a self that was lost or become somebody different. I think therapy helps people continue developing the self whose development was interrupted and arrested. And that changes how we think about healing. If we're trying to become someone different, healing can feel like we're constantly chasing a version of ourselves that we've never been, and actually that we may not be able to be. But if our authentic self has been there all along, healing becomes something else. It's less about becoming someone new and more about removing what got in the way of the development that had already started. One of my beliefs as a therapist is I don't believe children are born knowing who they are. I think they're born with a temperament, natural tendencies, gifts, strengths, interests, sensitivities, and ways of being in the world. But I think childhood is supposed to be a time where they are discovering what all of that means, what excites them, what scares them, what gives them energy, what drains them, what seems to come naturally, what requires more effort, but is still very interesting to them. All of that tells them who they are. And I think one of the primary tasks of childhood is discovering yourself. I also realize this is a newer concept, more in the modern world. I think there were times during history where childhood wasn't even a distinct period of time, where parents saw that they had something to do to contribute to the development of this person. I think there were time periods where kids were one more body to help the family farm succeed, or one more mouth to feed when they already had too many. So I realize that this idea of childhood being a distinct period of time that is valuable and where certain tasks need to be accomplished so that development can happen, I realize that's a more modern concept. I also think that's where healthy parenting plays such an important role. Healthy parents don't believe that they create their child's identity. Instead, they help a child discover it. They become students of their child, staying curious instead of assuming they already know who this child is. They notice, they observe, they encourage, and they make room for the ways this child might be entirely different from them. I remember when my two oldest kids were young, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down, they had been going through infertility treatment, and eventually they ended up adopting a child. We went down with a gift for mom and for the new baby and to see the baby. I was talking to this neighbor and she said, you know, the interesting thing I hadn't thought about with adoption is he feels like a blank slate. We have no idea who he will be. We don't have expectations of his personality because we're not looking at him as an extension of ourselves. I think it was something to that effect. We did talk about how that's an interesting perspective. And I did say, I don't know, even though my kids are our biological children, I don't know that I can project onto them who they are either, or think that I know what to expect from them. I think good enough parents spend their kids' childhood learning who their child is. And that's a very different approach to parenting than deciding who your child needs to be, who they should become. One of the ways that I think about healthy parenting is that it gives children permission to become who they are, permission to have preferences, emotions, permission to be different from their siblings, permission to disagree respectfully, to be curious, permission to make mistakes, and permission to take up space. That permission doesn't just last in childhood. Eventually, children grow up and they leave home. They'll have teachers, coaches, employers, partners, friends, communities, and a culture that all have opinions about who they should become. And the goal isn't to protect them from those messages. The goal of healthy parenting, I think, is to help them develop an internal reference point, an internal place to come home to when the world tells them who they should be. Healthy parents help children filter what fits and what doesn't. And that's very different from deciding for them who they should become. One of my daughters taught me this in ways I didn't fully appreciate until later. But I did appreciate it enough at the time that as her parent, I often said I ran interference for her. Sometimes I was out front, kind of clearing the space for her. Other times I felt like I was chasing behind her, being like, remember to be safe. Kelly is my third daughter, and she was born into this world very extroverted. I, on the other hand, am more introverted. I enjoy people. I enjoy social gatherings, but I also need time by myself to recharge. Like I said, though, Kelly came into the world very differently. When she was little and we'd go to the park, every time, within a few minutes, she'd easily find somebody there that she wanted to play with. When we were getting ready to wrap up and go back home, she'd come running back to me and say, Mom, you need to go talk to their mom because I invited them over for a play date. I remember thinking, I haven't even met this woman. I may not have even talked to her at the park. But Kelly had decided they were friends. So I would wander over, and this definitely put me outside of my comfort zone. I would walk over to the mom. We'd exchange phone numbers, tell her a little about myself, and I'd invite the child over for a play date. I would often tell the mom, you're welcome to come and stay. I know that you don't know me. I don't expect you to just let your kid come to my house when we just met at the park. And often the play dates did happen. Sometimes they didn't. As she got older, she played soccer, competitive soccer. And we'd finish a Saturday game and find out that she had already invited the whole team over to our house. Parents would often comment about how generous we were for always being willing to have the whole team over. Jeff and I would often laugh with each other because we didn't even know that this party had been planned. Kelly had just invited them and figured they'll show up and it'll go fine. Jeff and I finally came up with a phrase that with Kelly, we used over and over again. Plans are only wishes until you've asked mom and dad. We knew she wasn't trying to manipulate us. She wasn't trying to be disrespectful. And she wasn't trying to make our lives difficult. She was just being Kelly. She was telling us who she was. And we weren't trying to make her less social, less extroverted, more like us so that we could be comfortable. And we weren't trying to quiet her enthusiasm or convince her that spending time alone was somehow better. We were simply trying to help this child grow up. And yes, that meant teaching consideration. It meant teaching boundaries. And it meant reminding her that other people get a vote. It meant helping her learn. I would also tell her, you're going to have to learn how to entertain yourself as well, because sometimes nobody's available. I also think that being comfortable in your own company is an important life skill, regardless of whether you're an introvert or extrovert. But Kelly needed that lesson more than our other kids. From the time Kelly was young, she was an early riser and she went hard all day and then crashed, usually between 6 and 6:30 at night. For years, Kelly woke up at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., depending on whether we were on daylight savings or standard time. We could hear her feet hit the ground from our bedroom, come down the stairs. She'd walk right to our bedroom, open the door, and announce, "I'm bored." I'd tell her, "Yeah, that's because you're still supposed to be asleep." I meant it as a joke mostly, but underneath was the same principle. She couldn't expect people to be awake and available to entertain her at 4 in the morning. When she was young, often I would get up with her because she was awake. And when Kelly was awake, she went full bore. I didn't trust what she would decide to do that day. So I would get up and try to lay on the couch, half awake, half asleep, making sure she didn't make too much of a mess. But the goal was not to change her personality. Yes, our goal was to help her personality mature, but I don't think healthy parenting is about raising easy children. It's about accurately seeing the child you actually have and helping that child become a mature version of themselves. I've had plenty of adults sitting in my office who look back at childhood and they describe themselves with labels. I was a difficult child. I was stubborn. I was too emotional. I was shy, or I was bossy. I was demanding. I started wondering a long time ago if those labels actually tell us very much about the person, or if they were simply someone's interpretation of a child's immature expression. Kelly definitely would have been described by some people as stubborn. She would be described as having too much energy. She definitely had more energy in her pinky toe than most people have in their entire body. And she marched to the beat of her own drum. I've even had neighbors flag me down while I was in my yard to ask me a question or call me to ask a question. And often the question goes something like, they tell me a story about their child, and then they'll say, "Do you think my child's a psychopath?" My answer is almost always no. And then I start getting curious. I often will say, children are often impulsive. They're highly curious. Maybe they're strong willed. Maybe they're struggling to regulate big emotions. Maybe they are needing more of your attention right now. Or maybe something changed in their world that they're still trying to make sense of. There's a long list of developmental explanations I'd want to understand before I started drawing conclusions about who this child fundamentally is. Children do things that don't make sense to adults. That's part of being a child. They're immature, they're learning, they're experimenting, they're making mistakes. They're trying to figure out how the world works and how they work. I think that's why curiosity is one of the most important qualities of healthy parenting. Curiosity slows us down so we don't jump to conclusions. Instead of asking, what's wrong with my child? We might begin asking, what's happening with my child? Those are really different questions. Those chart a very different course. One is trying to label and is often driven by fear. The other is trying to understand and help give your child language so they can communicate that with you. Understanding behavior, though, doesn't mean excusing it. Children still need accountability. They still need limits, and they need guidance. But accountability and curiosity can exist at the same time. I think they're actually most effective when they do. Let me give you another story about Kelly. When she was about 3, my grandma, my mom's mom, had a really big aloe vera plant in her house. And one day my mom had Kelly, I don't remember why, and she stopped by my grandma's house with Kelly. As I've said, Kelly was very curious. As my mom, who was a school teacher and loved to teach things, was showing Kelly this aloe vera plant. She broke off a leaf and showed Kelly how if you squeeze it, the aloe vera comes out and you can rub it on a scratch or an owie, and it helps your skin heal. She also told Kelly that if you break a leaf off, it doesn't kill the plant. The plant just grows another one. And then she left the room. She went in the kitchen where my grandma was and left Kelly alone in the front room with the aloe vera plant. I don't know how much time went by, but my mom came back in and every single leaf of the aloe vera plant had been broken off. Kelly was covered head to toe in aloe vera. When my mom brought her back home to drop her off, she told me about this story. And she said, Jackie, Kelly is going to end up in juvenile detention if you don't do something. As if I wasn't doing anything. I remember thinking, she's 3, Mom. You know how Kelly is. You just told Kelly, this curious 3-year-old, that this plant helps people heal and that it grows back no matter what she does to it. And then you left her alone in the room with the plant. I did say that to my mom. From where I was standing, Kelly did exactly what I would predict Kelly would do. And a lot of 3-year-olds would do that, not just Kelly. That doesn't mean her behavior was fine. I also thought, shame on you, Mom. I don't do that with her. If I have Kelly in another person's home, I'm watching her. I don't walk into another room and sit and talk with somebody for 15 or 20 minutes and not have any idea of where Kelly is or what she's doing. My mom was drawing a conclusion about Kelly's behavior. I was seeing this as more about who Kelly is and how I, as a parent, had to keep an eye on her and the responsibilities I had as her parent. I think people can do this more than they realize. They see a behavior and almost without thinking, we assign meaning to it. Meaning about a child's character. when often what we're seeing isn't a character flaw at all. It's just an authentic quality that hasn't matured yet. I think parents are often asking themselves, what does this child need to learn? And that's a good question. But I also think there's another one just as important. What is this behavior telling me about who my child actually is? Now, that doesn't mean all behavior is healthy or that there shouldn't be consequences. That's how children learn accountability. It just means the behavior is communicating something. Curiosity, fear, sensitivity, determination, a need for connection, or a need for autonomy. Children are constantly telling us who they are. I think the question is, are we listening with curiosity? Or whether we've already decided who they are and we stopped looking for answers. And instead, we just give them consequences. When Kelly was little, I wasn't trying to raise a 3-year-old who never broke a rule or made a mess because I didn't think Kelly could do that. But I was trying to help a curious 3-year-old become a wise, thoughtful adult. I knew that to get her from this 3-year-old into the wise, thoughtful adult, I needed to guide her. And I also needed to give her some autonomy. I think we can easily mistake personality and character as the same thing. They aren't. Kelly's personality was extroverted. She was spontaneous. She had a lot of energy. She didn't sit still very well. And that was never going to change. And I don't know that that was supposed to change. Her character, though, was still developing. I think character is a different set of things entirely. Character is about responsibility, respect, consideration, self-regulation, honesty, accountability. Those things aren't wired in at birth. Those get built. Healthy parenting doesn't try to change a child's personality. Instead, it builds character around the personality that's already there. An extroverted child learns consideration and how to make room for other people instead of just filling every room that she walks into. An introverted child might learn courage, the willingness to initiate, to speak up, even when solitude would be easier. A highly sensitive child learns to emotionally regulate. They can still feel deeply without being flooded by their emotions. A highly driven child learns humility and balance, how to want things without needing to win at everything. The authentic self provides the raw material. Character is what gets built with that raw material. And that happens over years in relationship. I think that's really the whole distinction. We can't raise a different child, but we can help the child that we have grow the character that lets their actual personality work for them instead of against them. I remember another story I have of parenting with my youngest daughter, Grace. She was in 2nd grade. This one weekend, a new song had come out. And being the youngest of 4 girls, her older sisters had a lot of say over what songs she listened to, what shows she watched, and what she thought was cool. When this song came out and we played it, she absolutely loved it. She loved the rhythm. She loved the drums. She loved every part of it. I don't know how many times we played it that weekend. It seemed like it was just on repeat. That Monday, Grace had a dentist appointment, and I had to pick her up from school to take her. Before she came out and got in the car, I had the song queued up because I knew how much she liked it. She got in, the song started, and she just reached over and turned the volume down. I was a little perplexed, and I said, "What's that about?" She told me the two girls who were sisters that she walked to school with every day said the song was dumb. I thought about that for a minute, started to drive to the dentist appointment, and I said, you're going to find that a lot of people have opinions. And these two girls have their opinion. They can think the song is dumb. Maybe it's not the kind of music that they like. But you also get to have your opinion. You don't have to have the same opinions or like the same things in order to be friends with somebody. She didn't say much to that. We got to the dentist office, parked, went in. On the way back to school after her appointment, she turned the song back on. And she said, "I do like the song. I like everything about this song." I've thought about that moment many times over the years. I've had many similar conversations with many clients. I think children borrow confidence from their parents before they develop confidence in themselves. They borrow perspective before they develop their own. They borrow regulation because they're not born with the ability to regulate themselves. In healthy families, that borrowed confidence gradually becomes internal, it's external. Over time, children begin to trust themselves. They know what they like. They know what they need. They know what they prefer. They don't reject other people's opinions, and they also don't absorb them. They can evaluate them and ask, does this fit me? That's a developmental task that has to happen in childhood. And it doesn't stop in second grade. It's the same question a functional adult keeps asking themselves for the rest of their life. But they also have that internal reference point in place that helps answer those questions. Now, everything I've described so far assumes that the adults raising a child have enough capacity to stay curious. They have enough capacity to notice and to ask, who is this child? I also know not every parent has that capacity. Sometimes due to unresolved trauma of their own, they might have an addiction. Sometimes it's due to depression and anxiety. Sometimes it's emotional immaturity. Sometimes they're overwhelmed by financial stress, health problems, or a difficult marriage. And sometimes they're simply parenting the way they were parented because they don't know another way. I think for the most part, many of these parents love their children, but love isn't always the issue. Capacity is. When parents don't have the capacity to stay curious, for whatever reason, a child's developmental task changes. A child who feels emotionally safe spends their childhood discovering who they are, and parents are mirroring that to them. But a child who doesn't feel emotionally safe spends their childhood discovering what they need to do to stay connected. They become incredibly observant. They learn to read the room. But at the same time, they're slowly losing touch with themselves. Not because they don't have that authentic self. It's there, but it often has been buried under layers of what else they had to do. And paying attention to themselves did not feel like the safest thing to do. That's where so many of the adaptations we talk about in therapy begin. When people describe themselves as children, they often reach for words like, I was mature for my age. I was an easy child. I was a responsible child. People would say, wow, she's so mature for her age. Sometimes that's true. When my youngest was in kindergarten, she was in a kindergarten class full of oldest children, and she was the youngest. Her kindergarten teacher told me, yeah, I can tell she's the youngest. She said, the other kids, when I ask them what their favorite TV show is, they say Barney or Caillou. Grace says iCarly or The Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. She said, when I ask them their favorite song, they might tell me Wheels on the Bus. Grace named a Coldplay song. So yeah, sometimes that maturity is there just because of birth order. But sometimes what looks like maturity is an adaptation. The peacemaker learns to read the room before she's even fully in it. There might be tension in her jaw if there's a shift in tone, and she will smooth it over before anyone else notices that tension. As an adult, she's often remarkably good at keeping everybody else comfortable. She's also the last person in the room to know what she herself is feeling. The perfectionist learns that mistakes are dangerous, not just embarrassing, dangerous. So he becomes flawless wherever he can control the outcome. As an adult, he might produce extraordinary work and be wildly successful and still feel like a fraud the entire time he's doing it. He hasn't learned a mature expression of that trait. The invisible child learns that need draws attention, and attention didn't feel safe. So he or she takes up as little space as possible. As an adult, they can be in a room for an hour and leave without ever talking to anybody. The comedian or the jokester learns that if a room is laughing, it's not going to feel dangerous. And as an adult, he can make anyone feel better in 60 seconds. But he has no idea how to let anyone truly see who he is or to show up for him when he's not fine. The caretaker learns that she's valuable in proportion to what she does for other people. And as an adult, she can tell you everything anyone in her life needs. But if you ask her what she needs, she has no answer. The achiever learns that worth is earned through output. It's not given for free. As an adult, he can hit every goal that he sets and still feel underneath that he hasn't done enough to justify his existence. The addict learns something else entirely, something that costs more and takes longer to come back from. All of this makes sense. Children are remarkably good at figuring out what a household needs from them and becoming that. That's a kind of genius, actually. But surviving a childhood versus developing through one chart a very different path. But not all behavior reflects development. Sometimes behavior reflects adaptation. Development helps us become more fully ourselves. Adaptation helps us stay connected when relationships don't feel emotionally safe. The challenge is that adaptations get so practiced and they become so good at them that eventually they mistake them for their own personality. They will say, I've been this way my whole life, which may be true. But we're not thinking, I learned to become responsible because my family needed me to. We think, I'm just a responsible person. We don't think, I learned to ignore my own needs in order to avoid conflict and stay safe with my parents. We end up thinking, I don't really have any wants or needs. And yes, over time, survival strategies begin to feel like an identity. That's one of the reasons therapy can feel so disorienting at first. When clients start letting go of old adaptations, when they start seeing them and resisting them, they will often ask, well, if I'm not this person, who am I? This moment in therapy, this phase of therapy isn't a sign that therapy isn't working. It's often a sign that development has started again. I mentioned the addict, but I didn't go into much detail. I think the child that becomes an addict is doing the same thing, but there is a higher cost that they pay. Addiction is fundamentally an illness of escape, not from a substance or a behavior. That's just the means they use to escape. What they're escaping is feeling hurt, betrayal, pain, often emotional pain that's been there since childhood. Fear, often terror, abandonment, and underneath most of it, there's loneliness. And something also related, but different, that almost none of my clients have ever considered before we name it together: emptiness. Loneliness is more relational. It's the ache of missing other people. Sometimes I'll describe it as just mismatched needs. I'm having a need to be social and nobody's available, and I feel lonely. But emptiness is the pain of missing yourself. You can be surrounded by people and still feel it. In session, when I first ask a client to sit with the difference, most of them have never separated loneliness and emptiness. They might have spent years reaching for connection or an illusion to connection to fix a feeling that was never actually about other people at all. Escaping reality, even briefly, will bring relief. The problem is what happens when escaping becomes the only tool a person has. If mental health is a commitment to reality, no matter the cost, addiction is its exact opposite. Evading reality, no matter the cost. And reality doesn't just live in the mind. It lives in the body. That's actually where most of what a person is escaping is felt first. The tightness, the ache, the flush of shame. the hollow feeling of being alone or empty. So disconnecting from the body isn't a side effect of addiction. It's often the goal. You can't stay present to overwhelming feeling and simultaneously escape it. Something has to give. And for a lot of people, what gives is the felt sense of knowing what their body feels at all. That's why so many people in recovery describe feeling numb or describe not really knowing what they're feeling until it's already at a 10. They notice the emotions when they're at its peak, but they think they came out of the blue. They spent years training themselves not to notice, to be unaware. Getting sober stops the escape, but it doesn't automatically restore the connection to the body. That's the part that surprises people. Getting sober is necessary, but it isn't the same as healing. And it isn't the same as development resuming. A person can be sober for years and still be living entirely from the neck up, still unable to say what they're feeling in their body in any given moment, still treating their own physical sensations as background noise instead of information. The real work after sobriety is learning to come back into the body that was left, learning to notice a feeling before it's a crisis, learning that a sensation in your chest or a tightness in your stomach is data, not danger. That's not a metaphor for development. That is development. It's the same interrupted process we've been talking about the whole episode. Just picking up in a place maybe a lot of people don't expect. Not in a memory, not in a belief, although those might be there, but it's starting in the body. In a body that's been treated as unsafe to live in for a very long time. There's a rough progression to how identity actually develops. And I think it's important to also understand where things get interrupted. A child's first developmental question is simple. Am I safe? And that starts much younger than we realize. Before anything else can happen, before they are curious, before their personality emerges, before any of that, a nervous system has to answer that question. Not in a belief, but in the nervous system. Do I feel safe when I plug into the nervous system of the person who's holding me? When I'm crying and my parent picks me up, does that feel soothing or dangerous? That's what attachment is doing in the earliest years. Not shaping who you'll become, just establishing whether the world is safe enough to explore. And that question that starts so young gets answered in a lot of ordinary moments in early development. A child cries and someone comes. A child throws a temper tantrum or something small and insignificant. And instead of being told to stop or spanked, they're picked up and they're helped to calm down. A parent loses their patience. A parent is going to lose their patience. They're going to snap. But what matters is, does the parent come back and repair? None of those moments look like anything special from the outside. But thousands of them, repeated, or what tell a nervous system, yes, you are safe here. You can stop scanning for danger and start being curious instead. During adolescence, the question shifts. The question of I'm safe is either answered yes or no. But during adolescence, the question is, who am I? That's the work of the teenage years. Trying on identities, testing values against a wider world than just the family, figuring out what's actually yours versus what was just handed to you. And when they become a functional adult, the question shifts again. Given who I am, how do I want to live? Not who should I be? Not who does someone need me to be? Those would be the questions of an adult child. But the functional adult thinks, okay, given everything that I know about myself to be true, how do I want to live? Trauma and adaptation tend to interrupt that middle step of who am I? They arrive at adulthood without genuinely answering, who am I? Instead, they end up answering a different set of questions. Who do you need me to be? What keeps the peace? What prevents rejection? What earns love? What avoids conflict? Or instead, they do the opposite. The parent needs me to be this, so I'm going to be this. The parent wants this for peace. I say, hell no. My parent's going to reject me anyway, so I'm going to actually give them something to reject me over. Early in my career, when I worked with court-ordered teens, that was one of the things that I often heard from them. I'd meet with their parents, if their parents came to therapy, and I'd hear what their expectations were. But I also knew the story that this particular client was telling about his family. And sometimes I would point out to them, when your parents' expectations are these things, instead of complying, you just do the exact opposite. That's not actually you answering the question of who am I? Your parents are actually still determining who you are. It's just the opposite of what they want. Whether these questions lead into compliance or rebellion, none of those questions are identity questions. They're survival questions. Therapy is often the place someone finally goes back and answers the question that got skipped. Sometimes when I'm in a session with a client, and this might be good for you to take a moment, not if you're driving, but to close your eyes if you're comfortable and sit with yourself for a minute. And I might say, imagine you had parents who were emotionally available. Parents who were curious about you. They were protective when it mattered. They could repair after a rupture instead of pretending the rupture didn't happen. They were able to delight in who you were actually becoming. You'd still be you. We're not changing your personality or your temperament. But as you sit with that idea, what if I had the parents I needed? What parts of you might have had more room to grow? Would you know yourself more and trust yourself? Would you already know what you enjoy instead of still trying to figure that out? Would you recover from mistakes faster? Would the conflict of life that happens, feel less threatening? Would you still feel responsible for everybody else's emotions? Would you take healthy risks? Would you be able to say no and mean it? Would you feel like you were enough and not need to prove it to anybody? Often what I'm trying to get at is the point of asking yourself those things is not to imagine a different life. It's not, what if everything had been perfect? Perfect isn't possible. It's out the window. It is to notice specifically which capacities didn't get the chance to mature. Because those are the capacities that need to develop now. They're not lost. They're just still ahead of you. So how do we do that? Two things that I often talk about: reparenting and the authentic self. They're not the same thing, but I think they do work in tandem. Reparenting asks one question. As we look back over time, usually we're just picking one incident at a time, one age at a time, one moment at a time. I'm getting the client to identify it. And I'm asking, what does the wounded part of you need right now? And then I'm guiding the client to engage with that younger self and meet the need. Say what needed to be said. Do what needed to be done. Sit down on the bed with your younger self. Sit down next to them on the back steps and say, hey, I know what's happening right now. The authentic self asks a different question. Given everything I know, including what those wounded parts needed, what's the healthiest direction forward? Reparenting is comforting the wounds in the past. The authentic self is standing up and taking a step forward. You need both. I think about this in 3 layers, 3 different lenses on the same phenomenon. The authentic self describes who you are. It's identity. It's the part of you that knows what you think, what you feel, what you value, what you want, what you don't want, and what matters to you. It isn't reacting to survival things. It's the person underneath all of the adaptations. The integrated self describes how you function. Now, integration doesn't mean pretending the wounded parts or the survival adaptations, the immature expressions, don't exist. It sounds more like, I can hear my fear. I know how that developed. Or I can hear my shame. I know where that came from. I understand why people-pleasing showed up, or any of the traits we talked about. I understand why I want to withdraw. But these experiences don't get to run my life. Nothing gets exiled. Everything gets organized. And the functional adult describes what you do, the action you take. It's leadership. Your functional adult doesn't just regulate emotions. It takes responsibility for the whole internal system. It's the part of you that says, my feelings matter too. I'm going to ask for what I need. I can tolerate your disappointment. I'm not abandoning myself. I can validate you without invalidating me. And I don't need you to agree in order for my experience to be real. For a long time, survival has chaired the meeting. Fear makes the agenda. Shame makes the decisions. And people pleasing often casts the deciding vote. But something has to change. The functional adult has to stand up. Not to silence everyone in the room, but to lead. It can listen to every voice before making its decision. That's what makes it integrated, not just authentic. Let me describe how that leadership develops in the first place. Because I often have clients who are like, tell me how it was supposed to go so that I can see where it went off and I can also be aware of how to get back on track. So I would say it starts as something entirely outside of you. Healthy enough parents communicate it 1,000 small ways. Tell me what you think. Oh, that made you angry. I can see that you're different from your brother. I love how curious you are. Every one of those moments is saying the same underlying thing. You are allowed to exist as yourself. That's permission. And at first, it's external. The parent says you're okay. If it's said enough times by the parent, in enough ways, the child starts saying it to themselves. I'm okay. I know what to do. That's not the parent's voice anymore. That's become internalized. And that's a developmental marker. But also, permission doesn't stop needing reinforcement just because childhood ends. A healthy adult still runs into criticism, rejection, failure, and people who disapprove. The difference is they have an internal reference point to check those messages against. They can say, that doesn't fit me, or I don't agree, or I think I did make a mistake. When that internal permission never fully formed, every outside opinion becomes a referendum on the self. Someone criticizes them, and they assume that other person is right. Someone's disappointed, and they believe they must have done something wrong. They're still waiting for permission. They just don't have anyone left to give it to them. As that happens, something else starts to take shape. What I think of as the functional adult is the person that can hold their own life. They can tolerate discomfort. They don't need somebody to tell them, oh, that's not your fault. You did nothing wrong. They know if they did. They can act instead of just reacting. The functional adult is the one who starts giving permission, internal permission. The client used to look for outside of themselves. Instead of asking, am I allowed to feel this? Or am I allowed to want this? Am I allowed to say no? A client starts saying, I can trust myself. I had a client I worked with once. He was an only child. When his grandfather passed away, he was given the house that his grandfather originally built. He was young when he moved in. It was a nice enough home. He had 2 small children when he moved in, and his grandfather gave him a reasonable price. But as we were working together, he started saying, I have to store this stuff, and I have to keep this. His grandparents had been deceased for many years, but he still had a lot of their stuff in his garage, in cupboards, in closets, and he didn't feel like he could get rid of it. We started talking about, well, maybe you can ask family members if they want stuff. And if they don't, and you don't, maybe you can get rid of it. Maybe you can donate it. Put stuff that you want in your cupboards. As we were working through this, he came to a session and he said, I actually think I want to move. I said, okay. And he said, well, I don't know if I can move. He wasn't talking about financially. He was talking about, can he let go of the home his grandfather built? Nobody else in the family wanted it. He was the only grandchild. And I said, you don't have to keep it just because it was given to you. He contacted a real estate agent. They went looking at houses. He found a house. He loved it. And he said, well, I don't think I can buy it. Why can't you buy it? Again, it wasn't because he couldn't afford it, but he said, it has more space than I probably need. Okay. Eventually, he came to the conclusion, I love it. I want it. And I told him, somebody's going to buy that house. The owners are selling it. Why can't that person be you? He bought the house. The shift to I can trust myself starts to show up everywhere. You can advocate for yourself. Speak up for what you need instead of hoping someone notices. You're differentiated. You can stay yourself in a relationship and have connection. You can have boundaries, not walls, but boundaries that serve you. You can make space for your own emotions and meet them with understanding and acceptance. It also shows up as accountability. A functional adult can own a mistake without collapsing into shame. They don't have to explain why they did it. They can if they feel they need to, but they can also say, I was wrong. That's on me. Or I can see that I hurt you, without that meaning that they're bad or they're unlovable or something is defective in them. That's actually a sign of maturity and good mental health. Only a functional adult that feels safe can afford to look directly at their own mistakes instead of flinching away or defending them. And when that starts to happen, you can be your own best judge. You know if you did something wrong. You know if you need to repair. You know if you're being honest. You know if you need to share something. You can't fool yourself. And you can't lie to yourself. The functional adult also steps in for the wounded part, not as a replacement for the parents who couldn't give it, but as the healthier parent. They're allowed to have needs, they're allowed to say no, and they're allowed to be themselves. That's the authentic self matured, not erased by adaptation, not stuck in survival. They've actually done the work of growing up. One of the beliefs that I think is healthy to adopt during this work is that not everything we believe about ourselves started with us. I think one of the mistakes parents can make, usually with good intentions, is that they stop being curious. And I get it, parenting is exhausting. Instead of continuing to discover who your child is, it can be too easy to begin deciding who the parents think they are. Sometimes parents can even start describing them in ways that eventually become part of their identity, not in healthy ways. I have a client whose mother used to say to her, "You're the kind of girl who just wants one close friend." And she didn't really have words for it when she was younger. But as an adult, she said, "I don't think that was actually true about me. I think that was actually true about my mom. I liked having a lot of friends. I just preferred spending time with them one on one." Her mom wasn't describing her. Her mom was describing herself. And without realizing it, she'd projected her own way of relating onto her daughter. I think that easily happens. And many parents do this more often than they realize. They can say, "This is my shy child. He's my athlete. He's my dramatic one. He's my easy child. Oh, she's the responsible one. He's the smart one." Sometimes those observations are partly true about some authentic traits, but sometimes they're not. The problem isn't that we notice patterns. Healthy parents notice patterns. The problem is when we confuse an observation with an identity. There's a difference between saying, "I've noticed you seem to enjoy one-on-one conversations," or "I've noticed you enjoy having your friends over to play one at a time," and saying, "You're the kind of person who only needs one close friend." One is curious, the other starts to define. Healthy parenting reflects children back to themselves without prematurely defining them. That takes curiosity. It also takes humility, because every parent is raising a child who's different from them in some important ways. I've heard a version of this from other clients as well. One was told by their mother for years that they were the shy one. As an adult, they realized that wasn't really true. They weren't shy, they were just quieter than their brother, who often could fill every room he walked into. Next to the brother, a lot of people would look shy by comparison. And the person had spent decades believing something about themselves that was really a description of the brother and a gap between who they actually were. As I said at the beginning, I am more introverted. Kelly is way more extroverted. If I'd assumed my way of relating to the world was the healthier way, I could have spent years trying to make her more like me. And really, that was just making me more comfortable. I could have mistaken her sociability for impulsiveness. I could have decided she needed to quiet down, have fewer friends, and that it was bad to invite the whole team over on Saturdays. Instead, the question I kept coming back to was, what does Kelly need in order for her to mature? That question, I think, changes a lot, because healthy parenting isn't trying to produce children who all look the same. I've had teachers elementary school teachers, usually, or other people who will say to me, your daughters are all so different. And sometimes I respond and say, yeah, they're all their own person. I always am a little baffled when that reflection is given to me, as though because I have 4 girls, they should all be the same. I think healthy enough parenting is helping the child become the most healthy, mature version of who they already are. That also means remembering that every authentic quality has an immature expression. Your job as the parent is to help set that on a path for mature expression. When we forget that, we start seeing a child's strengths as problems. A determined child can get labeled as stubborn. A curious child gets labeled as impulsive. A sensitive child can be labeled as dramatic. An outgoing child gets labeled as too much. And a cautious child gets labeled as fearful. The authentic trait they were born with was never the problem. The job was to help it develop. When Kelly was 14, my mom picked her up and took her out to lunch for her birthday. When she brought her back home and was dropping her off, I talked to my mom for a minute. Kelly was busy going to find whoever was available to go hang out with. My mom said to me, we had a great time. Kelly had been telling her what she was up to, what she was doing, what she cared about, what she was interested in. I don't recall everything that Kelly had shared with my mom. And my mom said, she's actually delightful. And I smiled and said, so you don't think she's headed to juvenile detention? My mom said, Jackie, I never said that. I wasn't going to push the point because that really wasn't the point. And often our own parents can rewrite history instead of just saying, yeah, I got that one wrong. One of the things that I've learned as both a therapist and a parent is that the development of a person takes time. The qualities that frustrate us in a 5-year-old can become that same child's greatest strengths at 25 or 45 if they're nurtured instead of shamed. That's part of why I think it matters so much to separate behavior from identity. Behavior needs guidance. Character needs to be shaped. Character needs to be held up with responsibility, accountability, giving room to other people. But identity needs to be protected. And healthy parenting protects identity while it shapes behavior. Some of what we carry as identity is accurate. And it comes from a parent who genuinely saw us. Some of it is a loving observation that just wasn't quite right. And some of it is simply someone else's preferences quietly handed to us as if they were our own. Part of growing up is going back through all of it, keeping what fits, letting go of what was actually never yours to carry. And asking yourself, what have you accepted as true about yourself? And what did you believe was true because someone else said it? By the time Kelly was 4, she'd broken 5 bones, including an elbow that required surgery. and she'd quit preschool 2 times. That was not the end of breaking bones. She broke her arm several times playing soccer. Once, right at the beginning of a semifinal game in a tournament, she finished the game. We had a little bit of a break. We went out to lunch, then came back and played the final game. After the championship game, we get in the car to head home, and she says, "We need to stop by urgent care. I broke my arm." I looked at her and said, "When did you break your arm?" And she said, "Oh, when I got fouled at the beginning of the semifinal." I looked at Jeff, looked at her. I said, "Why didn't you say anything?" And she said, "Well, if I would have said anything, my coach would have taken me out of the game." Another time, she had a concussion. She had just been cleared by the doctor to play again. And before the next game, her dad reminded her, "Don't head the ball," because we didn't want it to re-injure. Late in the game, a perfect cross came into the box, and she was right there. She went up to head it and as she was going up, she yelled, "I'm sorry, Dad," on her way up. She scored. Her coach after the game was like, "That was hilarious." I think the whole stand could hear it as she went up to head the ball, yelling, "I'm sorry, Dad." But I think those stories also illustrate something important. Those moments were never evidence that she was a bad kid, or that she was too much, or that she didn't obey. They were evidence that she had tremendous determination that still needed maturity. Her persistence was never the problem. Did it need judgment? Yeah. Her courage was not a problem, but it needed wisdom. Her enthusiasm was not a problem, but she did have to learn boundaries. And I think that's not just true of Kelly, it's true of everyone. Every authentic trait has an immature expression and a mature expression. Neither one erases the other. The immature expression is often about age. And the mature version isn't a different trait. It's the same trait grown up. Determination, when it's immaturely expressed, looks like stubbornness. Its mature expression is perseverance. Curiosity, immature, looks impulsive, easily distracted. The mature expression is what makes someone a lifelong learner, maybe an innovator. Sensitivity, immaturely expressed, the person gets easily overwhelmed. The mature expression becomes empathy, real attunement to what other people are feeling, and an ability to express that regulated. Being an introvert, immature expression means we withdraw. We avoid conflict. We avoid people. Mature expression shows reflection, thoughtfulness, and genuine comfort in solitude. Extroversion, immaturely expressed, assumes everyone wants connection right now, just because they do. They can dominate the room. Mature expression builds community. It includes people. It energizes a relationship instead of consuming it. Courage, immaturely expressed, is reckless. Its mature expression is bravery. with wisdom. If you've been listening to this list, and I have more that I've been jotting down as I've been working on this episode, if any of them landed a little too accurately, that's worth sitting with, not as a diagnosis, but as a clue. Whatever showed up immature in you was never the wrong trait in the wrong person. It was often the right trait, the authentic trait. Just still waiting for enough safety to finish maturing. None of these traits were ever the problem. Not one of them needed to be removed. What they needed was room to keep growing. By the way, I've made a chart just to get my thinking around these traits, the authentic trait, immature expression, and mature expression. I'll put a link to it in the show notes if you're interested. When clients first come into therapy, what actually brings them in is a problem that they're trying to stop. But if we only focus on stopping the behavior, we miss the question underneath it. We miss what the behavior was trying to accomplish, how it helped you survive, and what it protected. Because every adaptation solved a problem. The problem is that eventually the adaptation became the only way you knew how to relate to yourself and other people. Becoming aware of that is important, but it also doesn't automatically lead to change. You can understand exactly why the adaptation exists and find yourself doing it tomorrow. Understanding matters. It's just not the end of the work. Healing happens when we start having new experiences. We learn we can disagree with someone and stay connected. That's part of why therapy can be so powerful. A healthy, safe, therapeutic relationship doesn't just hand insight to someone. It gives them a different relational experience. The therapist is curious, not judgmental. They're understanding, not shaming. And they can ask for accountability without rejecting you. Over time, those new experiences start to internalize, and the functional adult begins to emerge. Maybe with some encouragement still from the therapist or other people in your life. And the functional adult doesn't erase the adaptations. It understands them. It appreciates what they helped, but it also recognizes they're no longer needed. And gradually, it starts making different choices. That's why when I ask a client, tell me who you are. What do you want? Or what would your functional self do? How would your functional self weigh in right now? I'm not asking them to become somebody different. I'm inviting them to continue the development that got interrupted. Let me give you one more Kelly story. I have a lot, believe me. When Kelly was a senior in high school, she came home one day from who knows where, probably soccer. And she just casually mentioned something that caught me a little off guard. She said, I think I was lucky to have you and dad as parents. I said, oh, where's that coming from? She said, I've just been thinking about it. I think if I had different parents, things could have turned out a lot different for me. She didn't elaborate much beyond that, but I've thought about that conversation many times over the years. Now, I know Kelly does not believe, and did not then, that her parents were perfect. We weren't. We made mistakes. She stretched us too thin sometimes. There are things that when we look back, we would have done differently if we'd have known then what we know now. But I do think that she was recognizing that she had parents who tried to stay curious about who she was becoming. We tried to see beyond the behavior to the person. And we tried to protect her identity while helping her character develop. Today, she's 26. She'll be 27 shortly. And she's still incredibly social. She's still adventurous. She's still determined. She's still a lot of fun. She's a good time. And she has depth. That depth doesn't surprise me. When she was younger, some people saw the impulsivity, the broken bones, the invitations without letting her parents know what she was doing. They saw how fun she was, how spontaneous she was, how much she laughed. I've often quoted I think it's the 14th century Sufi poet who says, "Ever since happiness heard your name, it's been running through the streets trying to find you." I think that's a really apt description of Kelly. And it still fits her today. But often for other people, if they were having a conversation with her and she showed some depth, or she told them what she actually thought about things, they were surprised. But like I said, it didn't surprise me. Yes, I saw some of the same things that they saw. But we also saw curiosity, confidence. I saw someone who loved getting to know people, who wasn't afraid to try something new. She was fearless. Now she's fearless with wisdom. And none of those qualities needed to be erased. They needed to mature. I think healthy parents often aren't just parenting the child in front of them. They're also parenting the adult that child is becoming. And maybe that's the invitation I want to leave you with today. Maybe you had parents who became students of who you were. Maybe you didn't. Probably if you're listening to my podcast, you didn't. Maybe they loved you, but didn't have the capacity to stay curious about who you were becoming. Maybe they were overwhelmed by their own wounds, or their own fears, or the way they were raised. If that's your story, I hope you hear this. Your authentic self didn't disappear. It's not lost. It's not out there waiting for you to find it. And it wasn't broken. Yes, your development was interrupted. And instead, you learned adaptations that made sense. You learned how to survive. But those adaptations don't have to define the rest of your life. Children spend childhood telling us who they are. Good enough parents spend their kids' childhood learning who each child is. If no one spent your childhood learning who you were, it's not too late. Healing, in many ways, is becoming a student of yourself. Learning to get curious about your own thoughts instead of just immediately dismissing them. Learning to notice your own feelings instead of letting everyone else's emotions take up the space. Learning what brings you joy what matters to you, what you value, what kind of relationships you want to build. It's learning to ask, again, the questions that may have been interrupted years ago. Who am I? What do I think? What do I want? What kind of person do I want to become? What person is waiting for me to see it? As I've said before, I don't think healing is about becoming someone new. I think healing is simply continuing the development that was interrupted. And the beautiful thing about human development is that development doesn't end when childhood ends. As long as we're willing to stay curious, we'll keep growing. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.